The National Bolshevist Manifesto by Karl Otto Paetel. Translator's introduction on Paetel. Karl Otto Paetel was born into a solidly middle-class Berlin-Charlottenburg family on November 23, 1906. The son of a bookseller, Paetel developed literary and intellectual interests early, and, like most youth of his generation, his thinking and outlook was deeply affected by the experience of the Great War and Germany's subsequent post-war travail. The flourishing German youth movement, too, had a strong impact on his development. It was Paetel's involvement in various youth groups that helped reinforce his nationalist sentiments, as well as his appreciation for the comradeship that came with activity within the framework of a tight-knit organization united around a common cause. In 1928, Paetel enrolled at Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin, studying philosophy and history with the intention of becoming a school teacher. Paetel's studies were brought to an end only 5 semesters later as a result of his early forays into political activism. Defying a ban on demonstrations, a mass of students descended on the French embassy in protest against the Treaty of Versailles, Paetel among them. To his shock, he soon found himself slung into the back of a police vehicle, stuffed in between a communist youth on one side and a National Socialist doctoral student on the other. The consequence of Paetel's arrest once the university was alerted was the loss of his scholarship and his subsequent expulsion. With a sudden excess of free time on his hands, Paetel threw himself into journalism, writing articles for a variety of publications. He was particularly attracted to political subjects. Paetel at this time was still also active within the youth movement. By this point in his life, he had become a prominent figure within the hierarchy of the youth group Deutsche Freischau, the organization whose culture, initially at least, complemented his own nationalist sentiments. As he became more politically active, Paetel became much more strongly influenced by the new nationalism popular at that time, a nationalism that positioned itself in the revolutionary camp and rejected the stolidness of the old Wilhelmine era. Inspired by the work of figures such as Ernst Niekisch and August Winnig, Paetel's writing adopted an increasingly radical tone, his nationalism becoming imbued with a strong undercurrent of anti-capitalism. Yet as Paetel and his writing grew more radical, his position within the Deutsche Freischau became jeopardized. Paetel's open sympathy for communism, his approving reference to Lenin, his declaration that revolutionary young nationalists were the natural allies of the working classes, these sentiments were a step too far for the Freischau. After writing an article in 1930 which criticized President Hindenburg over Germany's ratification of the Young Plan, Paetel was forced to resign from his positions within the group. In May 1930, an increasingly radicalized Paetel decided to start taking serious political action. For a year, he and a number of friends had been working within an informal group called the Young Front Working Circle, an advocacy organization which tried to rally left and right-wing radicals to join together in common cause. Now Paetel and his comrades chose to reorganize themselves as a formal group with a formal program, seeking to do more than simply try and push members of the NSDAP towards real socialism. The Group of Social Revolutionary Nationalists, GSRN, they formed subsequently became one of the very few organizations in Weimar Germany which actually used the term National Bolshevist to describe itself. Avowedly revolutionary, the GSRN advocated for the overthrow of the democratic capitalist system, for a new government based on councils, for a socialization of industry and land, for a military alliance with Soviet Russia, and for the arming of the masses as a people's militia. The GSRN, whose members were, like Paetel, almost all of educated middle-class background, affirmed that it was the task of nationalists to work together with the class-conscious proletariat in pursuit of these goals. Despite this new sense of purpose, the initial focus of the GSRN, never a very large group, was on publishing and propaganda. An opportunity to engage in more lively action, however, was soon provided by the left. A debate with the GSRN over whether to support the NSDAP or the KPD, Communist Party of Germany, in the September 1930 election was suddenly resolved with the KPD's publication of its new party program, the Program of the National and Social Liberation of the German People. This new program was replete with nationalist language and demands, a deliberate attempt by the KPD to win back voters, lost or potentially lost to the NSDAP. The GSRN, however, saw it as potential evidence that the KPD was drifting in a National Bolshevist direction, and so Paetel and his comrades threw their firm support behind the communists. The GSRN thus became an ally of the KPD. Paetel and his group publicly supported the KPD during the election, writing articles, distributing propaganda, speaking at communist rallies. This cooperation continued on after the election, with the GSRN imploring nationalists to fight side by side with the KPD, declaring that only under the banners of communism would Germany be able to crush capitalism and liberate itself from the imperialism of the Versailles powers. GSRN members wrote articles for communist journals, joined KPD organizations like Anti-Fascist Action, and in March and April 1932, they offered public support for a presidential campaign of KPD leader Ernst Thälmann. The KPD, for its part, provided its own form of support at times, such as by assisting in the distribution of the GSRN journal Socialist Nation, but overall the relationship was fairly one-sided. It was this lack of reciprocity which led to a measure of disillusionment on the GSRN. Paetel came to suspect, quite rightly, that the KPD was hoping to co-opt and absorb his movement. Furthermore, by late 1932, he and his comrades had come to doubt the sincerity of the KPD's nationalism. As KPD-GSRN relations deteriorated, the ideological division between the two groups became more apparent. Paetel and his compatriots could no longer so easily wave away the fact that their end goal of a National Socialist sovereign German state allied with but independent of a sovereign Soviet Russia was fundamentally different from the ultimate goal of the KPD, borderless world communism. Although still pro-communist and supportive of the KPD, this division influenced the GSRN's tactics, with Paetel attempting to organize a separate National Communist Party to compete in the November 32 elections. An effort which failed due to the GSRN simply lacking the manpower and resources needed to bring forth a new legal political party. The National Bolshevist Manifesto was published by Paetel as part of a second attempt to organize a national communist electoral group. This time during the period in late 1932 to early 1933, when Germany was in political shambles. The NSDAP was bleeding support, the KPD was gaining votes but struggling with internal faction disputes, and the entire Weimar system seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet events overtook Paetel in a fashion that had not been predicted. The manifesto he had labored over was first published and distributed on January 30th, 1933, the day Hitler became Chancellor and victorious. Torch-bearing stormtroopers marched in massed columns through the streets of Berlin. Many of the copies of the manifesto were confiscated and pulped. Paetel's publication license was swiftly withdrawn, and the publications of he and his comrades were shut down. The GSRN did not last much longer, being banned along with the other communist and fellow traveler groups in the aftermath of the Reichstag fire. From that point onwards, Paetel experienced significant harassment from the government, particularly as he continued to associate with figures considered unsavory to the National Socialist regime. His name was included in a blacklist of suspected traitors during the events of the June 1934 Blood Purge, the Night of the Long Knives, and by 1935 things had become so heated that Paetel was forced to flee Germany for his own safety. After some time moving around Europe, he ended up in America, where he managed to find employment as an academic and eventually attained citizenship. In his later life, Paetel published a number of different works, several of them detailing the history of German National Bolshevism. He died in New York in 1975. Translator's introduction on the translation. This translation was made over the course of several months from early to mid-2019. From the next page onwards, everything, as far as is possible, is a replica in terms of content and style of Paetel's original National Bolshevist Manifesto. All the numbered footnotes within the text are Paetel's translated from the original German. The only change that has been made to them is put some of them into order, whether due to a printing error or complications in formatting and layout. The German version of the manifesto does not order all the footnotes sequentially. The details for footnotes, for instance, are preceded by footnote and followed by footnote 59, for instance, are preceded by footnote 60 and followed by footnote 58. For the sake of my sanity and that of the readers, I have fixed this for the English translation. Paetel in the manifesto makes extensive reference to newspapers, journals, books, and articles. Most of the original newspapers and journals Paetel references have had their German names left untranslated to make their identification easier. Paetel's own frequently appearing Sozialistische Nation is the one exception. I have consistently used the English translation Socialist Nation instead. Books and articles have had their names translated to make their contents more apparent to the reader, but the original German names are provided in brackets and italics for anyone interested in tracking them down. The only works I have avoided this with are those which are already widely known in English-speaking countries, such as those of Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Jünger, etc. At times in the text I have included the original German for a word or phrase alongside the English translation. This has mainly been employed when translating striking or unusual expressions, typically Völkisch language, which does not always have an easy direct translation in English. The only additions I have made to the text are my own translator's notes. These are indicated in the text using footnote symbols, to make them easily distinguishable from Paetel's numbered footnotes. The numbers are Paetel's, the symbols are mine. Sometimes these notes are employed to provide detail on a translating choice. More commonly they are there to offer some historical background to the reader. Much of Paetel's manifesto is concerned with discussing and dissecting the ideas and writings of his political and cultural contemporaries, and he additionally makes frequent literary allusions and references to German historical events. This all has the potential of being rather obscure to modern 21st century English-speaking readers. Paetel assumes that his readers will of course know, for example, who the communist Thomas was, or what the slogan of the 97% is in reference to, but this is less likely today than it was in 1933. I have endeavored to be as neutral as possible in these sections, since one thing I despise is an editor or translator trying to influence my opinion on a text. Regardless, I am aware that these notes are my own work and not Paetel's original, and the people have downloaded this document to read Paetel's words and not my own, so I have also attempted to make the separation as clear as possible. The translator's notes section are very clearly indicated at the end of the relevant chapters with a heading in a different font, and I have deliberately tried to make them as small and unobtrusive as possible. If people find them distracting or unnecessary, then I will happily issue an edition of the translation without them. I hope you enjoy this work. Please feel free to distribute it where you like. If you have access to the German original, there are PDF copies available online. I use the physical reprint from German publishers Haag and Hechen, and believe you can improve the translation, then also feel free to do so. The most important thing is that Paetel's writings are available. I have no special claim over them. If you have any suggestions, criticisms or suggestions, please feel free to contact me, bogomil@orplan.org. Bogomil, assume that's the name of the translator. Website orplan.org. So let's start with the text. The National Bolshevist Manifesto by Karl Otto Paetel. AK, dedicated to my good comrade. New tablets bear the writ of the new age. Let greybeards revel in their heritage. The distant thunder does not reach their ears. But you shall label all the young ones lackeys, who drug themselves on mushy music now, who skirt with chains of roses the abyss. You shall spit out what's decadent and rotten, and hide the dagger in the laurel wreath. Tuned to the new crusade in step and sound. Stephen George, 1913. Let us not push the revolution on further, but instead the ideas dormant within it which it itself does not understand. We want to combine revolutionary ideas with those conservative ideas which are eternally re-establishing themselves, to make them conservative revolutionary, so that we can attain a set of conditions under which we can hope to live again. These simple phrases of Müller-Vandenbroek should be of service to these pages, even where they go beyond them. No refutation of any ism, no academic work, only in the clear-cut distinction of the front's self-understanding for a young race that wants at any price, let me repeat it again. No refutation of any ism, no academic work, only in the clear-cut distinction of the front's self-understanding for a young race that wants at any price a free Germany, even if this price means breaking with yesterday. So we take up that dirty phrase, National Bolsheviks, Karl Otto Paetel. On the day of the historical torchlight procession, 30th January 1933. There is no German Reich, there is no German government, there is no German representation, there is only a colony of the Entente. We are natives of a colony. That's the entire cruel and unrelenting truth, which one must make peace with mentally before thinking ahead. From the Vorwärts of the 15th May 1919. Vision. The red flag flutters over Cologne Cathedral. Revolution over Germany. A radiogram from Berlin. To the German people, land and soil belong to the nation. The means of production are socialized. Elections to the Council Congress are announced. The verdicts of the People's Court on all the enemies of the socialist fatherland, all those responsible for the old regime, are enforced. The Treaty of Versailles is considered torn to pieces. Greater Germany is socialist. The imperialist bandit states are approaching. The Rhine is to be held under all circumstances. The counterattack is to be initiated. Long columns, black on black, trek across the Rhine bridges. Singing rings out. Flags wave in rhythm with the tramp of marching feet. Columns of workers, rifles shouldered, in their midst flags with the hammer and sickle. The bars of the Marseillaise, the fatherland is in danger, A short distance behind them come streamlined figures in brown shirts, above their heads the red swastika banner, and over that a red pendant with the symbol of labor, their armbands half covered with red stripes. A new column, grey on grey, endless troops of the Stahlhelm behind the war flags of the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Their flags also bedecked with the great pennant of the revolutionary uprising and peasant formations beyond them. A luminescent above all the flags, over red, black, white, red, and black banners, raising its wings, the black eagle of Prussia. Singing roars through the columns of the army, and the chorus is always growing stronger, and all the troops take it up, grey, brown, and red formations coming in. To the Rhine, to the Rhine, to the German Rhine, guardians we all want to be. And the shout sounds on, long live socialism, we carry the red flags on the German eagle into France. Forward. The voice breaks off, only the masses march, endless, with different flags in different dress in the same step, marching in enemy territory, suppressed freedom, bringing the Lord's retribution for a life of human bondage. This is the gateway to tomorrow, the way to it, the way we are. The task. Germany has to fight today for the freedom of its unfree-born children, for a future home for its homeless, for the future hopeless generations. But not only that, in German territory will the vision of our century be shaped. Here shall the formal principle of Mitteleuropa have to be proven. Footnote. The Mitteleuropa, Central Europe concept Paetel refers to here was discussed in German-speaking lands from the mid-19th century onwards, proposing the idea of Central European Federation, empire or trading bloc as a counterbalance to the Western powers on one hand and the Russian Empire on the other. In most concepts of the idea, such as Friedrich Naumann's 1915 work by the same name, Naumann himself was the progenitor of an early prototypical form of nationalist socialism. The Mitteleuropa power bloc would naturally be led by Germany or Austria. The fight for the sovereignty of the German lands will decide the fight for Europe's future, the rise or fall of the West. In German hearts and German minds today, the forces of the East are already feuding with the principles of Western thought. The solution will have to be to find one's own principle. In the body of the German people, Deutschen Volkskörper, within the German territories, the decisive battle will be fought between world mercantilist economy and socialist statehood. Here the class struggle between proletarian dynamism and bourgeois self-reliance will be fulfilled. Footnote. This has nothing to do with hazy Reich fantasies in the style of youth movement romanticism or the intellectual exercises of the Mitteleuropa ideologists. Both today drift into idealism. This is a footnote by Paetel. The last one about Mitteleuropa was by the editor. The task that lies before the young generation of political Germans is one of decades. To solve it means giving a new, creative meaning to that old, misused concept of the German imperial world mission, that, on the third attempt, Müller van den Broek's expression already carries this meaning, and here he references Müller van den Broek's book, The Third Reich. That on the third attempt, the German nation building, which was unsuccessful in the Ottonenreich and Stauferreich, as well as in the Bismarckian Reich, will become a reality. And here in footnote 2, even Lenin says in left-wing communism an infantile disorder, it would of course be grossly erroneous to exaggerate this truth and extend it beyond certain fundamental features of our revolution. It would also be erroneous to lose sight of the fact that, soon after the victory of the proletarian revolution in at least one of the advanced countries, a sharp change will probably come about. Russia will cease to be the model and will once again become a backward country in the Soviet and the Socialist sense. To break, there's a note about the Ottonenreich from the editor. Ottonenreich and Stauferreich are alternative terms for Ottonian and Hohenstaufen dynasties of the Holy Roman Empire respectively. Müller-Vandenbroek's expression is a reference to the concept of the Third Reich, an ideal popular not just within the National Socialist but among nationalists of all stripes. Otto Müller-Vandenbroek, one of the most influential conservative revolutionary intellectuals, is typically credited with popularizing the concept of the Third Reich, if not inventing it. To break away from this means gambling away the future of eternal Germany, shifting to Switzerlandization of the German folk into its final stages. Editor's note: the German word used here is Verschweizerung, which in English could be rendered as Switzerlandization or Swissification. In 1928, Völkisch journalist Hans von Liebig wrote a book called Die Switzerlandization of the German Peoples, Die Verschweizerung des deutschen Volkes, which is possible what Paetel is invoking by his use of the term. Switzerlandization, as von Liebig described it, is the process of a nation taking on the qualities of Switzerland, i.e. becoming a multi-ethnic society populated by different ethnic minorities with different languages and different cultures, all living side by side, without any real national sense uniting them. The name of the task is Becoming a Nation. Note by Paetel: the popular misrepresentation of the concepts race, folk, nation must finally be brought to an end. From racial and other indiscernible elements arose the folk. The nation as the historical form of this biological fact that emerges into the consciousness of the folk comrades Volksgenossen still has yet to arise in Germany. The task of socialism is to create a nation out of the mass and populace of the folk, or as Hegel would phrase it, for the people in themselves to become the people for themselves. There is therefore something inadequate in the definition given by Boroletto, Fascism and Nation Hamburg. The nation is a historical and biological concept. I think this footnote. Okay, I found it. The nation is a historical and biological concept. It is a unified, enduring, and indivisible entity of perfect existence, a truly autonomous social or political body. So, the name of the task is Becoming a Nation. Its guarantor is called Socialism. The path to it is revolution. Only those called to this task from within will understand what it is about, alone and above all. To open the door to tomorrow for a proletarianized folk, to break all its bonds, chaos, adversity, affirmation of victimhood, class, estate, granting it personal happiness, in order that reality for the German people shall be the nation as the highest value. "10 years of National Bolshevism. Wherever in young Germany today the deathly stillness of official politics is alarmed by an underground tremor, wherever the unconditionality of nationalist youth calls into question the old values of their fathers, over whose funeral shrouds the elderly wail with spread hands, registering the still emotional socialist demand of the national revolutionary young bourgeoisie. Wherever the proletariat seems to recognize that only the German eagle on red flags will create a fatherland for them which bears the national fervor of those without a homeland, there does one see into the bourgeois newspapers There does one see in the bourgeois newspapers a catchword, National Bolshevism. But what historical fact first arose in Germany to trigger the political movement meant by that phrase? It is not enough simply to take a pro-Russia policy as its criterion, to see in it simply nothing but foreign policy, not at all. Its conception of a foreign policy is indeed only the self-evident result of a very basic assessment. The first truly national Bolshevist document was the political testament of Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, in which he set down the belief that a German radical socialism must take in hand beneath the banners of socialism a policy of freedom against Western imperialism and capitalism. Footnote 4 and 5. The quote from the English Prime Minister Lloyd George in Vienna's Neuen Freien Presse shows how dangerous this possibility appeared to the status of Versailles. The steady expansion of communism in Germany represents a grave danger for the whole of Europe. The war has shown what a powerful people the Germans are when they are put to the test. That's why a communist Germany would be far more dangerous to the world than communist Russia. I cannot imagine any greater danger for Europe, yes, for the whole world, than for there to be a great communist state in Central Europe, directed and maintained by one of the world's most intelligent and disciplined peoples. Brockdorff-Rantzau's refusal to sign the Treaty of Versailles, Lenin's offer to the People's Deputy to support the resistance of the Rhine, these were the political realities behind it. A footnote about Brockdorff-Rantzau. Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau was a German diplomat of Prussian noble heritage. Despite his background, he accepted the post of foreign minister in the Ebert government of the November 1918 revolution. On June 20, 1919, he resigned his position in protest against the government's signing of the Treaty of Versailles, deeming it a crime against Germany. An advocate of German-Russian rapprochement, he afterwards became ambassador to Soviet Russia until his death in 1928. Although not a National Bolshevik himself, Brockdorff-Rantzau's writings nonetheless contained both German nationalist and anti-capitalist sentiments, endearing him to later national revolutionary radicals. So, Brockdorff-Rantzau's refusal to sign the Treaty of Versailles, Lenin's offer to the People's Deputies to support the resistance on the Rhine, these were the political realities behind it. The second National Bolshevist wave was the policy of fraternization pursued by Hamburg National Communist circles under Wolfheim Laufenberg, alongside and with the KPD after their expulsion from the alongside and within the KAPD after expulsion from the KPD, with parts of General Leto Vorbeck's Freikorps in Hamburg and other cities. Later there were the efforts in Munich to come to a policy of joint action between the communist Thomas, Völkisch Police President Pöhner, and the fellows of the Freikorps Oberland, attempting such organizing in Thuringia, in the East Prussian border guard, and yes, among the Kapp soldiers. Writings such as Wolfheim's Nation and Working Class, a dissertation against the methods in Russia titled Moscow and German Revolution, the open letter to Major General Leto Vorbeck, Communism, a National Imperative, by Judicial Councillor Krupfgans, among others, these were the ideological weapons with which those within the circles of the Communist Party and the right-wing radical groups campaigned for this synthesis. Die Hamburger Volkswart and at times the Kommunistische Arbeiterzeitung were the available representative newspapers. In practical terms, all these efforts came to nothing. Siegt made it clear that he would put down any national communist uprising. In the meantime, national socialist groups formed. The KPD proscribed the Hamburg circles, and the connective threads in Hamburg between men like Stapel, A.E. Günther, and a number of nationalist youth leaders that had led to the National Communists were torn away again. Wolfheim, who in Hamburg had power in his hands on November 6, 1918, was neutralized by the revolution of the National Assembly. Later, the Ruhrkampf once again led to the revival of these tendencies. After Schlagetter's execution in 1923, Karl Radek on the 20th of June delivered to the Central Committee of the KPD his famous speech titled Schlagetter, the Wanderer into the Void, which called on the honest nationalists to integrate into the front of the Red Revolution, which alone would fight for national freedom, as the Ruhrkampf was being betrayed yet again by the bourgeoisie. The debate between the communist Radek and Fröhlich and the nationalist Reventlow and Müller-van den Broek over going a bit of the way together was thereupon initiated in the Roten Fahne, the Völkisch Reichsfahrt of Count Reventlow, and the Ring of Baron von Gleichingen. Likewise, that too eventually failed. So the Ruhrkampf was about the French occupation of the German Rhineland. Radek's line was abandoned first by the KPD. Wolfheim remained for the most part alone. In 1929, these concepts, which had in the meantime become worked out ever more clearly and concretely, were revived again by the other side, this time by the right. First in the Jungen Volk, then in the Kommenden, two newspapers of the National Revolutionary Youth were National Bolshevist demands First in the Jungen Volk, then in the Kommenden, two newspapers of the National Revolutionary Youth where National Bolshevist demands were discussed. In a special edition which committed itself to the class struggle, the complete socialization of resources, and to a greater German council state, the National Bolsheviks for the first time presented themselves to the general public. Ascension Day 1930 thus saw the group of social revolutionary nationalists establish themselves around the National Bolshevist theses and the foundational work Social Revolutionary Nationalism, Sozialrevolutionärer Nationalismus. From here, the other national revolutionary groups became more and more infected with this tendency. The socialist nation became the national communist mouthpiece. Such a national Bolshevist position is today no longer so surprising as it was years ago. Ever more circles of people, especially of the younger generation, are today of anti-capitalist disposition, or through their mindset National Bolsheviks, even if they do not use the term. And where does one still find youth today, who, turning their attentive eyes on their era, on the unemployment offices and working districts, are still willing to justify and defend a social order that prevents 95% of the German people having any share at all in what they're supposed to call their fatherland? It is the honest prerogative of youth to break down the old defenses, and youth defines the features of German National Bolshevism. Daily do we realize how right Frank Thies was, one of the few of our father's generation who joined with us, when he observed, "In Germany today a new faith is emerging, a faith in the autonomy and hyper-reality of the nation, in the inescapability of their unifying compulsion, in the immutability of our destiny, in the indestructible force of our will to live. Only at the time of the greatest economic hardship and unspeakable adversity could there be raised over this life of destitution and austerity a dome of faith in the unified lives of the nation. Only at the time of national misfortune is a genuine national worldview possible. Indeed, the will to a new order of divergent parts pushes us towards a new state ethos. But such ideals do not spring into the world overnight. Rather, they fulfill themselves in spasms of crises over the course of decades. There are long years of disappointment, hardship, and experience necessary to achieve them. A new world begins, a new nation is formed. Yes, an invisible revolution is perpetually in progress. Only its outer course has a revolutionary character, the way old truths whose binding value still had validity a decade ago are abruptly washed away, and instead their newly emerged objectives, which were scarcely taken seriously before, autarky, nationalism, a classless people state, bound agriculture, etc., this whirling speed of events taking place amidst a phenomena that stands there steady like a rocher de bronze, all this has something of the soundless drumbeats of revolution, an appearance that is magnificent, sinister, and historically unprecedented. Young nationalism. The youth in Germany are today faced with a concrete decision, either jeunesse dorée, to be the last contingent of yesterday's age, in clear acknowledgement of the hopeless situation of the bourgeoisie who have failed politically in every circumstance, the shameless capitulation of the capitalists in the Ruhrkampf before General Degut at the moment state subsidies were cut off is but one of many examples. Or else, as socialists, to be guardians of the original values of German history and even of bourgeois culture, standing in solidarity with the proletariat in their class struggle without sentimental prolete cult. There is no compromise solution. Prolete cult would be like a cult of proletarians, but in a negative sense. This decision does not cut off German youth from the history of their people and the facts around which every political decision must be oriented today make the choice clear enough. The lost war, doomed to its entire structure justifying unfolkish politics, free class franchise, due to the bourgeoisie's corruption amidst the commercial tumult, this made us into the most profoundly anti-bourgeois. The lost revolution, doomed to the half measures and lack of instinct on the part of its leaders, lost out of blindness towards the national task of radical upheaval. This made us all the more revolutionary. The lost sovereignty of Germany, its doom guaranteed by the liberal capitalist Weimar Republic and sustained through its subordination to Paris and Wall Street. This made us unequivocal nationalists. The lie of the Volksgemeinschaft, a lie which defamed the process of renewing the body of the folk, Volkskörper, and was embodied in the new state's people destroying, volkszerstörend, striving for power. This made us fighting comrades in the class struggle. The hopeless fate of all post-war generations, the recognition that this fate is contingent on an anti-grassroots, propertied bourgeois capitalist. Okay, it's gonna repeat the whole sentence. The hopeless fate of all post-war generations, the recognition that this fate of contingent on an anti-grassroots, propertied bourgeois capitalist order. This made us into anti-capitalists, made us into socialists. Unquestionably, the bündische willingness, as demonstrated by the Jugendbünde, the Freikorps, and so on, to subordinate oneself and one's own freedom to the we, to the self-selected collective, is not to be underestimated. It is pre-political rather than a fact of politics. Ultimately, it is a pedagogical category. The Bündische ideal is not a political principle. It does not have to commit itself to a concrete manifestation in German politics. All the theories that the Bündische Front can achieve state power tomorrow and will be able to transfer the laws of collective life from young people to the state order are indeed beautiful, but are regardless just romantic utopianism. The true fronts work differently. The youth movement has many accomplishments. Its educational aspects are undeniable today and can no longer be undone. Politically, however, it has failed all along the line. In order to evaluate German politics correctly, the youth movement has to learn one thing: the significance of the Germany of big cities, the unemployment office, mass actions. The youth movement is dead, long live politics. This slogan, which years before closed out a leadership conference of one of the largest Bünde, although there were never any real consequences resulting from it, must be taken seriously at last by every single Bündische type. Then and only then will power and success for the whole be pried from the substantial force which undoubtedly exists there. Being young is not a virtue, and generational conflict is nothing new in the process of biological law. Only when, at the crossroads of centuries, youth stands at the precipice of a decaying spiritual epoch, does the generational question take on a historical and therefore also political meaning. Even the youth movement, not engendered by any aspirations but born out of alienation of the lives of the young from the sociological and ideological values of their fathers, taking shape as the struggle for the autonomy of youthful community life, has no political mission per se. To want to spur on the politics of the youth movement as the political fronts of Germany today, a dream that many of us once clung to, is absurd. Attitude and intellectual openness are not yet political values. Birth certificates are not political identity cards. Existential consciousness is only a pre-political basis, never a political criterion. There are no political duties for a young generation as a whole. Beyond that, one would have to take into account how much the individual age groups between 18 and 40 differ today in their basic rhythms. But there is an approach for the youth that sees the nation as the central value of their personal lives and their societal function. The revolutionary bourgeois youth, which to this day undoubtedly for the most part sees in National Socialism the fulfillment of its vision of combining the national and revolutionary economic impulses, is the sociological bearer of what the bourgeois call National Bolshevism. There are no politics for the Jugendbünde, cut off from the fronts of their fathers. There are no politics for the young generation in the battle of youth against age. But there is a mission for young nationalism, particularly in the post-war youth, which, after over 10 years of the front generation's struggle in vain, only they are able to resolve. To plant the flags of the nation in the camp of the class struggle, to pass on by the word of mouth the catchword Germany in the Heerban of the revolution, to form alongside the formations of the proletarian parties an order of nationalist, anti-bourgeois and anti-capitalist revolutionaries. To establish the focal point of immortal Germanness in the camp of today's fatherlandless, in readiness of the morrow's duties, that is the task of young revolutionary nationalism. Only there can the questions which face Germany's youth today be answered. We do not consider, following Oswald Spengler's counsel, endure the lost position of a sinking boat, like the Roman soldier whose bones were found in front of a gate in Pompeii, who died at his post because, during the eruption of Vesuvius, they had forgotten to relieve him. Reformed National Socialism? Some time ago, there came from the press an announcement of the founding of a German Socialist Party, which had set itself the goal of uniting the miscellaneous National Socialist splinter groups and secessionists, and as a kind of purified National Socialism, to honor the premises not fulfilled by Adolf Hitler and to reoccupy the political position he had abandoned. Anticipating that the true National Socialists, after recognizing the betrayal of their previous leader, would turn instead to the reformers. The term German nationalism was often used interchangeably with National Socialism. Both were intended to denote a socialism that was the antithesis of the internationalist un-German ideology of Marx and Engels. One of the earliest national socialist parties in Germany was called the German Socialist Party, founded in 1918, a few months before Anton Drexler's German Workers' Party. It was for a brief period the largest and most prominent NS party in the country, feted by the National Socialists in Austria and Sudetenland, before its eventual absorption in the NSDAP in 1922. The party Paetel is actually referring to here was a fairly minor group which had split off from the NSDAP sometime around August 1932. The German Socialist Workers' Party, Deutsche Sozialistische Arbeiterpartei, DSAP, occasionally also referred to as the German Socialist Party or German Social Party. Its leaders, Arno Franke and Wilhelm Klute, had both been active NSDAP members, although Franke had started off his political career as a Social Democrat, and both had become bitterly disappointed with the party over time, particularly with its organizational structure and with what they perceived as the pure qualities of the local leadership. The DSAP was intended to advance a more pronounced socialist line while avoiding the corruption and authoritarianism which Klute and Franke alleged was dragging down the NSDAP. Its leaders thus hoped that it would draw in all those of National Socialist disposition who were nonetheless wary of Hitler or other prominent party figures. The group at its peak had never more than 2,000 members, and its activity was concentrated solely within Berlin and parts of Saxony. Like the other National Socialist splinter groups, of which there were many in the early 30s, the DSAP was banned after Hitler assumed power. Klute survived past the end of the war, but Franke was arrested in 1933 and likely died in a concentration camp. The claim to represent true National Socialism is not new. Both the fighting community of revolutionary National Socialists, which constitutes the core of the Black Front led by Dr. Otto Strasser, actually both the shell and the core are identical, as well as the independent National Socialist Combat Movement of Germany of Captain Stennes makes such a claim. The numerical weakness of these groups is not an argument against their political capabilities. The evolution of the Hitler Party has made one sufficiently skeptical of the superiority of the big boys against the splinters. But following from the political and societal function of such front formations, what remains is the basic inquiry into and following that the search for the historical departure point But following from the political and societal function of such front formations, what remains is the basic inquiry into and following that the search for the historical departure point for a reformed National Socialism. The main reason why every attempt at reform, an approach which puts their mission into the wrong from the very beginning, involves turning against the NSDAP is due to the accusation of personal inadequacy against the old party leaders, of the leaders' deviation from the old and in principle correct 25-point line, as well as their pursuit of the wrong tactical measures. The 25-point line is the National Socialist, the party program. They all want to be National Socialists, those who turn against the unsatisfactory Hitler against the influence of the big shots, Bundesokratie, against the creeping bourgeois mentality, and against the Brown House, against the incorrect legal measures of the party leadership, each believing themselves to be the one in possession of the true ring. Otto Strasser has to that end provided the framework of a worldview of the 20th century. Captain Stennis appeals to the revolutionary sentiment and yearning of the SA members. The German Socialist Party is turning away from the incorrect measures of the last quarter. And here is the breaking point of all these attempts. Being an opposition group can be valuable. The fate of the various options within the Marxist camp, however, shows clearly enough that the most auspicious fate awaiting an opposition is that its arguments, 3/4 of which are only ever in respect to tactical differences, will one day be silently accepted, with the conscience of the party thereupon, without any further ado, shedding its entire reason for existence. If, however, the failure of the Hitler Party is not due to the inadequacy of its leading personalities, but is based instead in the party's fundamentally poor decisions, then any such reformer misses the core issue and becomes a miniature copy of the bigger brother, never the bearer of historical laws. The fascist mistake. The disastrously misjudged historical mission of that which quite justifiably might have been called National Socialism can already be seen in the Hitler Party's first month of work in 1919, in which the anti-statist resentments against Berlin, which are practically a philosophy of life on the other side of the main line, where it is preferred to look to Rome rather than to the land of the Prussian Gau, were underlined by a pronounced historical mistake, a mistake which definitely rejected the character of the Germanic uprising against Paris. At the moment when those under Versailles alone were capable of making history, the slogan of rebellion against Versailles was supplemented by the domestic political slogan against Marxism, turning on its head the willingness to, in the party's name, to take the side of the destitutes or homeless, the fatherlandless, in order to create for them a homeland via radical change to societal and economic life. Upon realizing that the demand of the hour was, through socialism to the nation, the calculation of the fascist propertite bourgeoisie became beat Marxism and to eliminate folk-destructive class stratification. Thus the principle of the NSDAP committed itself to was false from the start, which therefore dooms to failure every attempted renaissance of its spirit, which reaffirms the same principle. A look at the development of Italian fascism demonstrates the inevitable, obligatory lawfulness of such a fighting position. In recent months, Dr. K. A. Wittfogel was unequivocally able to prove, on the basis of old ideological texts, that the first fascist programmes bore a thoroughly revolutionary socialist character, roughly equivalent to the German USPD. So long as the fascists stood by these demands, they simply remained one among many troublemaking frontline fighters' associations. At the moment, however, just as occurred in Germany in 1919, in which the bourgeoisie, menaced by the Bolshevik wave, recognized the chance to deploy these militant forces for its own security, then fascism emerged theoretically and practically as an anti-Marxist force, and unambiguously assumed a societal function as a security organization for the establishment. When on the 1st of May the cells of fascist railwaymen made it impossible to carry out a general strike for the first time in Italy, when the fascist fighting leagues, with clandestine support from the government, liquidated the syndicalist occupation of the factories, then had Mussolini, completely ignoring the old radical points of his program, created the psychological conditions for the anti-Bolshevik forces to to more or less gladly clear the way for the establishment of peace and order. The historical error of the NSDAP. The parallel is obvious. The seven-man council in Munich, as an anti-Versailles force, and likewise through its alignment, the emotional anti-capitalism of breaking the bondage of interest, only attractive to the uprooted revolutionary layers of radicalized front soldiers, students, etc., became a piece on the chessboard of sluggishly reviving bourgeois politics at the moment it became clear that from them, with the bourgeoisie's gracious toleration of their youthful exuberance in expressing radical feelings, the forces could be formed that would be able to push back against the advancing Marxist working class and possibly be in the position to eliminate them. In a situation where the urgent decision to be made on the class forces was increasingly clear-cut, whoever took up the slogan against Marxism in the battle between capital and labor had to remain willingly or unwillingly indifferent out of necessity in order to be able to side with those who had every interest in repudiating Marxism's political and economic claims to power. Finance capital and large landowners, jobless officers, and restoration-obsessed feudal lords all could at the moment overlook a few programmatic blemishes, since they still demonstrated the NSDAP's possibilities for returning the distribution of power in German politics back to its old state. The blame for this development does not lie with the incapable Osaf Herr Stennes, Herr Strasser, or even with Herr Schulze, who were likewise powerless to escape from the internal dynamic. One may reject certain points of the Marxist program, one may maintain that its worldview is deficient and out of date, but one will refute it neither by coaxing nor with stormtroopers. It can only be overcome from within itself. Russia shows that as nationalists, one thinking on German politics today must be in terms of force, not ideologies. It can only be overcome from within itself. Russia shows that as a nationalist, one's thinking on German politics today must be in terms of forces, not ideologies. On the one hand, there is today a government whose domestic policies signify the darkest reaction. The further intensification of class distinctions, the creation of a living subhumanity under the state of exception, in which the national unity necessary for achieving sovereignty is thoroughly weakened. A foreign policy directed towards France with Christian intentions of intervention, and the fascist movement as the exultant trustee of the bourgeois legacy, united with the propertied middle classes and incapable of national liberation as well as of socialist revolution. And on the other hand, there are the revolutionary working classes, organized in and with the KPD, negating the fundamental principles of foreign policy enslavement from Versailles to Young, and ready for the revolutionary deed which will transfer the economy into the hands of the whole, making the fatherlandless the stewards of the new fatherland that will create the nation. With such a clear and hopeless separation between the two, revolutionary nationalism cannot wait around as a third front until both are rendered obsolete and internally overcome. Otherwise, the third front will become, as per Hans Zehrer, the front of last authority, the Reichswehr. Revolutionary nationalism must take sides. In other words, to unambiguously be fighting comrade. In other words, to unambiguously be a fighting comrade, to be the anti-Versailles forces, to be with the formations that want to fight for the socialist fatherland of tomorrow, one must therefore belong at the side of the KPD, where the struggle for work, the nation and socialism is being fought, where the class struggle is affirmed as the path to revolution. Nationalist communism. From the beginning, a succession of relatively small far-right groups have kept their distance from the NSDAP, their spokesmen never having associated with the party, which today consciously stand against them because they are national communist and anti-fascist. The more apparent it becomes that Adolf Hitler is unable to honor his promises, the promises with which he today holds the columns of idealistic anti-capitalist youth, the young, already thoroughly sociologically uprooted bourgeoisie, under his banner, alongside the crowds of people anxious to safeguard their own interests. The closer the hour comes when in Germany the long mocked and long scorned position of national communism can be realized. Today we are still utopians, but the far-sighted among the conservative grail keepers already see the danger from them approaching on the horizon. Albert Erich Günther, the co-editor of the Deutsche Volkstum, wrote, "In the national revolutionary youth which provides momentum to the national opposition, a deep suspicion sets in. Shall we one day be led as white storm columns against a red flood? These and other insights awaken mistrust among the foreign policy of credit-hungry business groups. So it stands to reason to decide against white, that is, for red, National Bolshevism." If we are on the right track in this attempt at interpretation, so can we also predict that the moment the exponents of economic reason gain influence over the national opposition and bring them not economic relief, but instead a new subjugation to France, the National Socialist masses undergo a transformation in their state of being. They become National Bolsheviks. National Bolshevism will then attain the same fervor as that of National Socialism, but it will also be directed against German entrepreneurship, perhaps by a different ecstatic drummer. This analysis, written at the time of the Brüning government, is still valid. It particularly applies to Hitler's situation. And the conservative politician who expects a lot from National Socialism already knows that it portends for bourgeois nationalist politics when he beseechingly continues, "The strength of National Bolshevism cannot be discerned from the membership of a party or group, nor from the circulation of periodicals. One must have a feeling for the youth's willingness to decide for National Bolshevism in order to grasp how suddenly such a movement can spring from a circle of sectarians into the folk." If the failure of the Hitler Party becomes clearly obvious, following from its renunciation of economic restructuring and socialist construction, and following from its readiness to leave the treaty series untouched, then the activist revolutionary forces who will be freed from it as a result will not be able to be maintained with half measures as the oppositions offer, but will want to go completely over to the side of socialism. The largest percentage of the people, however, will not go over to the KPD out of its deep suspicion that its national sentiment is mere tactics and not grounded in its innermost being. Here then is the mission of German national communism: to form the cadres who are prepared for the sake of the nation to sever all bourgeois ties, who no longer have any relationship with the values and judgments of their fathers, since they were plucked from their jobs, studies and careers and turfed out onto the street, and who, for precisely that reason, want Germany, a Germany that is their own. The mission of the national revolutionary groups is to be the rallying point of those who, in a fighting community with the Marxist KPD, form a front of those revolutionaries and socialists who, as non-materialists, avow the nation as the ultimate value, but who were also ready for a radical revolution for the sake of the nation, because only that creates the preconditions for nation building. Three different things make this political situation politically effective. Consistent will. To be socialist is to be socialist in the truest sense of the word. to become aware of oneself as non-Marxists, to be nationalists of faith and knowledge, and the fundamental rejection of any desire and attempt to reform National Socialism. Not reformed National Socialism, but a bloc of uncompromising young nationalists forces in Germany with steadfast socialist will, unwavering nationalist faith, recognition of the practical situation conferred through Versailles, fighting comradeship with the KPD. Only in this way, and not in the fashion being muttered about today by those who, in reality, only mean National Socialism without Hitler, and who want to pull the rug out from under the KPD, is the formation of an organized German national communism worthwhile. The KPD will become its compatriot, and fascism and quasi-fascism will find in it their most dangerous opponent. It will have to step forward when the time is right. The face of national communism. In outline, German national communism proclaims that we recognize the necessity of the German socialist revolution. It is the spiritual transformation that determines the economic, political, and cultural features of our time. It is in effect the revolution of the workers, peasants, and proletarianized middle classes. We commit ourselves to the nation. It is our last political value as a faithful expression of Völkisch community. We commit ourselves to the folk as the natural ethnic cultural community in contrast to ethnically destructive Western civilization. We commit ourselves to the intrinsic meaning of German folkdom. We commit ourselves to a socialist planned economy which, after breaking the capitalist order, binds folk and nation into an organic economic structure and as a social economy constitutes the foundation of state sovereignty. The fulfillment of our aims is the free, greater German People's Council state as the expression of the self-government of the productive folk. The means of production ought to be transferred to the nation as common property and the nation's fundamental ownership of land and soil to be declared. Consequently, naturalization of all large-scale and medium-scale industrial enterprises, immediate extensive settlement of the East with expropriation of the large estates, partial awarding of small holdings to second and third peasant sons and to farm workers as Reich entails, partial socialization of state goods, replacement of Roman private law with German common law, state monopoly on foreign trade, naturalization of the monetary system, for the transitional period of the revolution, autarky of the economic region of Russia-Germany, German autarky as the ultimate goal. The situation today calls for ruthless struggle against all foreign policy enslavement treaties, from Versailles to Young, until they are torn to shreds. Struggle against all aspects of the Weimar system and its sanctioning of external servitude, from Hilferding to Hitler, until it is annihilated. Struggle against Roman politics in German territory. Struggle for a racially appropriate religiosity attuned to the German people as a precondition for Völkisch unity. A policy of alliance with the Soviet Union, supporting revolutionary movements to seize a united front of all oppressed classes and nations. The situation today necessitates the most severe execution of the class struggle of the oppressed against all who represent the private capitalist dogma of the sanctity of private property. That is the only way to the German sovereign socialist nation. To safeguard the revolution against seizure by international capital and against counter-revolutionary aspirations, the Revolutionary People's Militia, Volksheer, shall replace the mercenary army at the moment of revolution, and the indivisibility of Greater Germany is to be proclaimed upon the establishment of the socialist state. And some footnotes. In contrast to Roman law's basically unrestrained subjective concept of property, which treats land and soil as a commodity, Germanic thinking recognizes only the clan, the family, the cooperative, Marktgenossenschaft, as responsible administrators of property. Even in the broader sense of the law, the Germanic conception is always bound to the community. Gemeinschaftsgebunden, not subjectively individualistic. Note 28. Adolf Hitler in the Daily Express, London, 9670, 4th May 1931. I do not demand the restoration of the German pre-war borders. I do not ask for Germany's colonies back. To achieve these goals, this is what is necessary today. A fighting community of revolutionary nationalism with the class party of the revolutionary proletariat, the KPD. Why not KPD? As this demonstrates, revolutionary nationalism and the communist movement today are unquestionably on the same side of the political front line in the struggle against fascism and capital and for socialism and national liberation. Why are we not in the KPD? Revolutionary German nationalism strives for, as its ultimate goal, the sovereign German nation existing in a community of free states of peoples, Völker, independent from one another. Revolutionary Marxism, the KPD, strives for, as its ultimate goal, the classless society, which, through the slow death of the state and the amalgamation of nations, unites the peoples into a higher unity. Revolutionary nationalism affirms the class struggle as an organic upheaval in the leadership of the body of the folk, which by replacing the obsolete ruling classes reorients the youthful new state to a leadership based on the political and social functions of the whole. Revolutionary Marxism views history as a succession of class struggles, with victorious participation in such struggles as the means by which the international proletariat can overcome international capitalism with international socialism. It recognizes the bondage of class over the boundaries of the primary reality that is the folkdom. Some today are fighters for national freedom and class fighters for the sake of the nation. Others are both for the sake of a classless society. Revolutionary nationalism strives for the implementation of a socialist planned economy on the basis of autarky, for the transition to a German-Russian autarky, for the elimination of private ownership over the means of production, and for the nationalization of land and soil, all as precondition for the sovereignty of the nation to be created by the revolution. Revolutionary Marxism strives for the planned economic organization of the world, negating autarkic economic areas by eliminating private ownership of the means of production and socializing land and soil. Socialist construction in a country, Russia, is only conceivable as a preliminary stage. Revolutionary nationalism does not believe in the possibility of eternal peace, in a humanity capable of nullifying. Revolutionary nationalism does not believe in the possibility of eternal peace, in a humanity capable of nullifying the antagonisms between different peoples, friend-enemy principle. Revolutionary Marxism strives for a pacified world, guaranteed after the abolition of economic antagonisms. Revolutionary nationalism strives for an appropriately German solution to the peasant question, Bauernfrage. It is of the conviction that an integration of the small peasants into the planned economy through a private property abolition fief system must preserve the eternal category of the peasant and must be utilizable by the state as a reservoir of power. Revolutionary Marxism strives to liquidate the regressive class through collectivizing and rationalizing farming operations, with the end goal being a synthesis with the worker into a higher classless human type (Russia). Revolutionary nationalism understands the potency of the idea, the need for religious renewal, and the existence of irrational forces. It sees in the idea of the nation its ultimate goal and in folkdom a fatefully imminent power. All political and economic imperatives are the means of giving this idea form and reality. Revolutionary Marxism, building on historical materialism, interprets the processes of human history from their economic conditions and assigns the ideological superstructure to the secondary role. Belief in the irrational is to be, and certainly will be, overcome. Revolutionary nationalism is anti-fascist because fascism, aside from its racially alien characteristics, fremdvölkischen Zügen, does not understand how to incorporate the leadership of the proletariat. In its economic order is only a reform of capitalism, and in its corporatist state form is a camouflaged dictatorship over the working folk, which thereby perpetuates the division of the nation into ruler and ruled. Revolutionary Marxism sees in fascism a militant self-defense movement for the structure and interests of the capitalist system, directing the movements of the petit bourgeois masses with pseudo-ideologies formed for the purpose of its own preservation. Revolutionary nationalism strives for a political and economic alliance with the Soviet Union, as the only European opponent of the Versailles system and as a socialist neighboring state. On these grounds, it fights against any intent of intervention against Soviet Russia. Revolutionary Marxism calls for the defense of the Soviet Union as the fatherland of the working people and the beginning of world communism. Revolutionary nationalism rejects any intention of acquiring colonies in recognition of the fundamental rights of oppressed peoples to national freedom and in accordance with its own watchword of national sovereignty. On the path towards a community of free peoples, it hails the liberation movements of India, China, Egypt, etc. as allies in the fight against the signatory powers of Versailles, just as it hails the international struggle of the proletariat against international fixed capital. Revolutionary Marxism hails the national revolutionary movements of colonial and semi-colonial peoples as precursors of the proletarian world revolution. Revolutionary nationalism resists the use of the racial question, Rassenfrage, for the establishment of a born-to-rule master race, rejects race dogmatism as a criterion for foreign policy, and in the construction of socialism demands as evidence for the value of race not entitlement but achievement. Revolutionary Marxism sees in race an economic category that receives its true meaning in a classless society and rejects its usage in forming political slogans. Revolutionary nationalism sees in the council structure the self-governance of government of the productive folk, the guarantee of political accountability and economic control of the Volksgemeinschaft, presaged in the early forms of Germanic rule. Revolutionary Marxism strives through the council structure's division into executive and legislative powers to move towards the eventual superfluidity of the state. Already in these few comparisons and putting aside more detailed descriptions of their individual points, the number and scope of such examples can be supplemented as needed. It follows that the world goals of nationalism and of Marxism are thoroughly different. It nonetheless also follows, however, that the necessities of today's politics yield a range of demands and insights from Marxism and nationalism, which coincide: class struggle, revolution, socialism, councils, foreign policy, anti-fascism, although their rationales for them are different. Young nationalism, however, has a mission for tomorrow extending beyond this front today. It is unity of faith and blood with the political principles of formation. Under this insight, the small cadres of National Bolshevist nationalism are formed today alongside and not within the KPD. Nevertheless, they affirm their affiliation with it because, notwithstanding the differing objectives, the Communist Party in Germany today is the only mass factor. against the Versailles system, against the Roman Counter-Reformation, against the drive to intervene against Russia, against the fascist deception of the people, for the socialist revolution, for Greater Germany. War and peace. War and peace can never in themselves be judged per se. The denial or affirmation of their value and status is decided only in relation to the requirements of völkisch life, völkischen Lebens, the national will to self-determination, and those unique personal decisions that affect the national destiny which dominates the lives of individuals. Those unwilling to see and address every problem from the perspective of their individual experience will only be able to pass such a judgment when the relationship to this aspect is clear. War can only be approved of when it is definitively established that it is essential and unavoidable for the future freedom and viability of a folk. Only if its squandering of the folk's substance, Volkssubstanz, is justified by a greater and more secure future for the Volksgemeinschaft itself. But a folk that is in Germany today, as in Germany today is merely an object of the politics of other states, can know only one alternative first. First freedom, then peace. A war for the sake of freedom always receives, and the invention of gas weapons has changed nothing from the times in which death was brought by sword and spear, its inner sanctification. But never will nationalism itself be able to frame the struggle between peoples in such a fashion. It is earnest in attributing the supreme nation, absolutum nation, as the source of everything that it does. War is the continuation of politics by other means. This quote from Clausewitz demonstrates that the question of the affirmation or rejection of war cannot be posed abstractly, but must be derived from the meaning, the legitimacy of politics, whose continuation it is. Only that communicates the essential. Dr. Kurt Hiller, for example, accuses me of letting the frivolous position of Ernst Jünger, of whom I quoted something without refuting it, not be given a sufficiently sharp differentiation. Ernst Jünger is and will remain a beloved example of the daring new nationalists. He has given us, as the author of The Adventurous Heart, an eternal bravery of the nationalist faith. But his rationale for war in Fire and Blood, in which he expressly rejects sourcing the justification for war from anywhere, not even in the nation, but instead derives its raison d'être from the unique, great, intoxicating opportunities for adventure it provides in fulfilling the laws of the earth. We leave no doubt that this must be rejected. Just as little can we accept Jünger's much too non-committal political demand for the state, which should be social, defensive and authoritarian. The question of war and peace, of which the revolutionary pacifist senses no hint of a distant sound in our country, and cannot be posed in absolute terms at all, and can only be answered in the context of what for. As national revolutionaries, we stand for the nation as the ultimate value. Its existence and sovereignty is the political criterion. Only from this position can everything that happens be appraised, even the question of war and peace. Carl Schmitt has taught us one thing. For as long as a people exists in the political sphere, this people must, even if only in the most extreme case, and whether this point has been reached has to be decided by it, determine by itself the distinction of friend and enemy. Therein resides the essence of its political existence. Schmitt, the author of one of the best books on political romanticism, builds on Adam Müller's thesis. Eternal peace cannot be the ideals of politics. Peace and war should complement each other like movement and repose. Mutual relations between states are the prerequisites for growth and prosperity. That means simply that the sovereignty of the socialist nation is the only benchmark according to which the actions of one revolutionary socialist state can be assessed against another. The young socialist Professor Hiller, admits this, for example, when he avows the national self-determination of the German people to be the immutable goal of our contemporary foreign policy decisions. The implicit respect between socialist nations excludes neither the necessity nor the possibility of military confrontation. Choosing to position oneself to others as friend or foe connotes that, as Carl Schmitt correctly infers, war is only the most extreme consequence of enmity. It does not have to be common, normal, something ideal or desirable. But it must nevertheless remain a real possibility for as long as the concept of the enemy has meaning. And thus the notion of the enemy will not be able to vanish, even in a socialist aggregation of free peoples, so long as state sovereignty is demanded, so long as its safeguarding through living space and its own laws of life durch Lebensraum und eigene Lebensgesetze must always be guaranteed anew. Even among those of us outside this aggregation, no one sees in war simply an alarm clock, a means of awakening creative impulses. Not personal opportunities for adventure, but the collectivity's law of life determines the decision. Revolutionary nationalism thinks politically, not ideologically. Hence, that is why it does not believe, so as long as the concept of the political becomes a reality for the sovereignty of the state, that the decision by a people to be the friend or enemy of another can be done away with. That also means ultimately affirming the existence of war as ultima ratio, not as a value in and of itself, but as the last resort for the safeguarding of state sovereignty. The acid test will be the today outdated question of space, Raumfrage. The socialist state, which unlike in capitalism will not artificially restrict the biological power of a folk, abortion, will someday find itself facing a surplus of humanity, people without space. What then? The Marxists answer that, as a consequence of amicable agreement, the population surplus could be settled in other, less populated parts of the earth. Perhaps Siberia contradicts utterly the nationalist conception of the inseparability of the folkish organism. Here then will this ultima ratio be demonstrated. Either the folk freely receives its Lebensraum, or it takes it for itself. Even a socialist nation will here make a decision, friend or foe. Highest above all is the folk's right to exist, even in socialism. For everything that is required of us happens for the sake of Germany's eternal meaning, whose manifestations change, but whose core is immutable. The state of the Germans, as a generational succession of German people, one of Adam Müller's true basic principles, is a state of fate. Happiness or freedom. On the point of whether decisions should be oriented from the individual or from the collective, another of Dr. Hiller's questions will be answered. Hiller, in his work on social revolutionary nationalism, quotes the sentence, which incidentally does not originate from Ernst Jünger like the quote before, but is a comment of my own. We stand on the side of the insurrectionary proletariat for the sake of the nation, not for the sake of few ideas of humanitarian happiness. He then asks, these bringers of misery, these outspoken brutes, these monsters who do not hide that they are monsters, does their ideal nation require that its members be miserable? No, Dr. Hiller, no. However, in Saint-Just's speech against Danton, for example, there is a passage which shows what we mean. The love of fatherland is a great and terrible thing. It is without mercy, without fear, without respect for the individual when it comes to the public good. This love brought Regulus to Carthage and Marat to the Pantheon. We are socialists. We support the revolution, the class struggle, the socialization of the means of production, the nationalization of land and soil, a state structure on the principle of self-determination. Why? Because we see in these demands, which represent the political position of an enslaved proletarianized folk, a semi-colony of foreign imperialists. The only path forward for carrying out the integration of the oppressed, disenfranchised, homelandless proletarians, which is necessary for the restoration of the nation's sovereignty. For the sake of the nation, for the sake of its people, socialists, that does not mean the lunatic wish to see these proletarians miserable in their new state of affairs. But indeed, we do demand from the individual, as Saint-Just demands, as is done in Russia, a sacrifice of happiness and affluence for the development of the community, which through its freedom and power will again be capable of giving happiness and freedom to its members. We want to smash economic liberalism to pieces to free the economy for the totality, the nation. As the socialist nation liberates its members, the path towards cultural assets as well as to political rights and workers' participation in the economy in the context of the we is conceived of as being for rather than against the individual. Only we echo Saint-Just. When the call sounds that the fatherland is in danger, then these rights are handed back to the nation, everyone divesting himself of them. The nation as the highest value. In a passage from the previously discussed article by Hiller, we remain with this topic because it is symptomatic of the dispute with the left in general. It is said of the national revolutionaries that they come over to us from nationalism as something that needs to be overcome. Elsewhere, approvingly, he says that they don't relinquish one jot of the golden core of their national sentiments, something alien to those with crippled souls. Those two quotes appear to be contradictory, but in reality they are quite related. Hiller, like Marx, respects the nation as existent today, and is even willing to concede to the continued existence of its golden core, i.e. its cultural aspects, language, customs, sense of homeland. However, exactly as Lenin so clearly said in his essays on the national question, parallel to the withering away of the state, there is to be an amalgamation of the nations into a higher unity. There is also Jaurès' view, which does not exhaust the political meaning. The nation is the treasury of human genius and progress, and it would be wicked for the proletariat to smash those precious vessels of human culture. The concept of sovereignty is alien to him, as it is alien to Lenin and Stalin, in an otherwise superb analysis of the nature of the nation. But we know that there is an innate meaning ingrained with folkdom, that here, as Ernst Jünger formulates it, the magical zero point from which politics and economy, life and form derive their order. We know that central value of the nation, as the faithful expression of this folkish community, does indeed abide within all material forms of manifestation, that nation building itself is also a very concrete affair. But we also know that this ultimate value has an existence in itself which is not worth affirming today, but is reactionary and worth overcoming tomorrow. It is beyond the determinations of space and time when exactly racial, geopolitical, economic and other components of the folk emerged. But at some point something happened amongst a group of people and they became the historical phenomenon that is the German folk. In Germany, likely as a result of specific incidents between the 6 tribes, Franconian, Swabian, Bavarian, Thuringian, Saxon and Frisian. Spengler has rightly determined that peoples, Völker, are born, i.e. that they can appear and perish in historical terms, but never suffer an evolution and suddenly become something else tomorrow, like a human race. Lagarde's expression, every folk is a thought of God, makes it clear that this faith in the faithful basis of völkisch existence, völkischen Dasein, is beyond discussion on a purely rational level. It is therefore a misconception on the part of Marxists when they frequently deem our political radicalization to be the sign of an evolution towards their position, that one day we shall also overcome our today somewhat troublesome metaphysical childishness and thus our idolatry of the nation. That belief is the very basis of our being. End of discussion. Everything that we want politically, all our efforts on the level of practical politics to master reality with its own laws, which are on account of, not in spite of, our metaphysical reasoning, are a consequence of our position of faith in the laws of eternal Germanness, ewige Deutschheit. Because and only because we know that these real values are inalienable, are we as nationalists, and not in spite of that fact, able to disengage ourselves from the economic and political foundations of our sociological homeland. Faith and will are not opposites, but polarities. Only where nonsense is pushed on religion at the political level does irrationality become absurdity. Only where one hides one's half-hearted involvement in the issues of the day behind metaphysics does one arrive at Hanussen and Weissenberg, instead of at the proletarian and the class struggle. The ultimate value of the nation, certainly, seems to us better suited with the latter than with the former. Objective but in themselves substantiated comparisons demonstrate that today the revolutionary left groups of the class-conscious proletariat, including Marxist and core but not Today the revolutionary left groups of the class-conscious proletariat, including Marxist and core but non-Marxist liberal outsiders like Hitler, are following the same path as the national revolutionary movement in the anti-capitalist, anti-fascist front line. It is in the goals for tomorrow where opinions divide. The goal of a higher unity of mankind, where the idea of the state and the concept of sovereignty are called into question, is juxtaposed on the one hand against the concept of a community of nationally separate, independent, free socialist peoples on the other. A concept where the socialist nation is regarded as a nationally sovereign form of life, unable to negate basic political principles, the friend-enemy principle, which, as a consequence, makes the fiction of eternal peace appear totally implausible. A concept where in the socialist state an individual's expectations of happiness are conditional upon national and state demands, where the universal, self-consuming nature of German nation-building will be tamed through the polarity of the Prussian principles of militant state life. To be Prussian is a matter of will, not of birth certificates. Where the nationalism of the cell of the folk, family, the basis of the state, provides the bund of men who make history. We cannot accept, when Engels wrote to Bebel in the 1875 program letter, now, since the state is merely a transitional institution of which use is made in the struggle, in the revolution, to keep down one's enemies by force, it is utter nonsense to speak of a free people state. So long as the proletariat still makes use of the state, it makes use of it not for the purpose of freedom, but for the suppression of its enemies. And as soon as there can be any discussion of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. Marxism and the national question. That Lenin in any event saw this as a future goal is unarguable. He expressed it clearly and unambiguously. It is with pride that we can say, at the first Congress we were in fact merely propagandists. We were only proclaiming our fundamental ideas among the world's proletariat. We only discussed the call to fight. We were merely asking where the people were who were capable of taking this path. Now the advanced proletariat is everywhere. Everywhere there is, albeit often poorly organized, a proletarian army, and if our international comrades will now help us to organize a united army, then nothing will prevent us from accomplishing our task. Prevent us from accomplishing our task. The task is a proletarian revolution, the creation of a world Soviet republic. Trotsky too, in his pamphlet Against National Communism, clearly puts forward the slogan of the United Soviet States of Europe. Or, as Lenin puts it, the socialist movement cannot triumph within the old national framework. It creates new, higher forms of human coexistence in which the legitimate needs and progressive aspirations of the working masses of each nationality will, for the first time, be satisfied through international unity provided existing national partitions are eliminated. Lenin further says, in the era of imperialism, there can be no other salvation for the majority of the world's nation than through revolutionary actions undertaken by the proletariat of the great powers, spreading beyond the bounds of nationality, smashing those boundaries, and overthrowing the international bourgeoisie. If this overthrow does not occur, the great powers will continue to exist, i.e. the oppression of nine-tenths of all nations in the world will remain. But if the bourgeoisie's fall does occur, it will enormously accelerate the downfall of each and every national partition. In the sessions of the 16th Congress, 1930, June-July, Stalin expressed himself unequivocally on the issue of the future of national languages. But as far as the future prospects of national cultures and national language are concerned, I have always been and will always remain of Leninist opinion that at the time of socialism's victory on a world scale, where socialism will infuse and strengthen the way of life, national languages must merge into one common tongue, although this tongue will neither be Great Russian nor German, but something new. In contrast, a line of dialectical idealism can be drawn from Fichte through Hegel to von Ranke. The relationship of the individual to the spirit of the people, Volksgeist, is that he appropriates this substantial existence, that this becomes his character and ability, that he may be something, for he finds the being of his folk as a wide, established, firm world before him, with which he has to incorporate himself. From Hegel's lectures, or as Hegel formulated it in his Foundations of the Philosophy of Right, the march of God in the world, that is what the state is. Its reason is power, actualized as will. In considering the idea of the state, we must not have our eyes on particular states, nor particular institutions. Instead, one must consider the idea, this actual God by itself. And Leopold von Ranke, Political Dialogues, states that all the states in the world that count for something are suffused with their own special tendencies. It would be ridiculous to interpret them as little more than protection agencies for individuals who've banded together to protect their private property, for example. On the contrary, these tendencies are of a spiritual nature, and the character of all their fellow citizens is thereby determined, indelibly imprinted upon them. Müller-Vandenbroek refers to this avowal in his Die Eternal Reich, das ewige Reich. Every folk embodies a special thought that belongs to it, just as it itself is an indivisible whole belonging to itself. It is born with this thought. With this thought it breaks away from the bosom of race and earth and hurls itself into historical space. But Lenin quite clearly says the opposite in his articles on the national question. Marxism is irreconcilable with nationalism, but be it even the fairest, purest, most civilized brand of nationalism. Marxism substitutes the internationalism in place of all forms of nationalism, the amalgamation of nations into a higher unity, a unity that is growing before our eyes with every mile of railway line built, with every international trust, and with every workers' association formed. An association that is international in its economic activities as well as in its ideas and aspirations. The proletariat cannot support any consolidation of nationalism. On the contrary, it supports everything that hastens the abolition of national differences and the removal of national barriers, everything that makes the ties between nationalities closer and closer, everything that leads to the merging of nations. Against these hypotheses, which as predictions are, of course, based on faith rather than knowledge, we position another. Assume the Marxist thesis to be correct that being determines consciousness, more likely there may be interplay between the two, we are of the belief that a new socialist being will also shape a new consciousness, insofar as that sense of attachment to the values of homeland, soil and folk, absenting from the capitalist being, will restore itself, and of itself restore a strengthening of the national character. But the drive towards assimilation, towards a withering away, will never arise. On the contrary, the outcome instead will be an ever-growing awareness of national distinctiveness, an ever-growing involvement in the German historical tradition, an ever-growing consciousness of one's own formative principles, i.e. the will to live as a sovereign socialist nation. Is however but a simple dilettantism of Otto Strasser's, not much improved by its backwards-looking pathos, when he always reduces the debate with Marxism in his excitable disputations down to the set formula. We and you want socialism, but the path is different. You want it on an international basis, we on a national one. The first is impossible because of every country's different economic maturity and because experience shows that the Comintern has achieved nothing. Strasser, if you were to read the Marxist writings, would find that sentiment far better expressed in them, such as in the program of the 6th World Congress of the Communist International, 46th session from 1st September 1928. Unequivocal economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism. Unequal economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism. It is exacerbated even more acutely in the epoch of imperialism, hence it follows that the international proletarian revolution cannot be conceived as a single event occurring simultaneously worldwide. At first, socialism may be victorious in a few or even in a single country alone. But every such proletarian victory broadens the basis of the world revolution and consequently further intensifies the general crisis of capitalism. The capitalist system in this way approaches its final collapse. The dictatorship of finance capital breaks apart. The second of Strasser's claims is not proven in all instances, the Russian Revolution being based, for example, on the here denied international way. So there is no split between the fronts at all. There is nothing contradictory in the way nationalist socialism can be quite international, working together with all those other forces seeking to take down the same adversary. The final goal, however, is achieved by separation. That Marxism rejects the socialist nation is proclaimed by Lenin. The idea of the judicial separation of nations from one another, the so-called national cultural autonomy of Bauer and Renner, is a reactionary idea. This is the same goal, whereby the different nature of the current practices of Russia's nationality policy is by no means misunderstood, as Trotsky describes. Marxism takes its point of departure from the world economy, not as a sum of national parts, but as a mighty and independent reality created by the international division of labor and the world markets, and which in the present epoch holds sway over the national markets. The productive forces of capitalist society have long outgrown the national powers. The imperialist war was an expression of this fact. Compared to capitalist society, socialist society must represent a higher stage in respect to technique of production. To aim at building a nationally isolated socialist society means, in spite of all passing successes, to pull back the forces of production even as compared with capitalism. Attempting to realize, independent of the geographical, cultural and historical conditions of the country's development, which constitutes a part of the world unity, a self-contained proportionality of all branches of the economy within a national framework, means pursuing a reactionary utopia. But nationalist communism, before Marx, incidentally a man in the French Revolution, had already put forward entirely communist demands for the sake of the nation. Fouché in the Lyon's instructions knows that this was the goal, knows that with this a goal, a fata morgana, is placed before the German people, knows that it can only mean communism, yes, but as a German duty of order within the boundaries of the nation. That is what calls us, not the world economy. Rural Revolution. The new nationalism, born in the hearts of those who no longer have any connection to the bourgeois lifestyle out of clear recognition that no political dynamism can be expected from it, is beginning today to turn its hopeful gaze over the forces of the revolution towards the Landvolk movement. That from there, where the strength and substance of the German people are still rooted, tomorrow shall be built. And a romanticism begins to unfold, which, nourished by the mouth of the black flags, nourished by the legendary myth of the name Klaus Heim, disdainfully turns itself away from the uprooted metropolitan masses, disdainfully turns itself away from the materialistic slogans of the proletariat, believing in the new rebirth of folkish life from the soil, and reckoning that it can dispense with worker, city, and asphalt. But that perspective completely overlooks that the driving forces behind the will to resist, especially in the case of the peasantry and the landfolks, every attempt at self-help, are actually in the end derived solely from the personal plight of the individuals in question. There, where peace is driven from the farmyard, the leaves collected under compulsion, the farmer reaches for a scythe and drops the bailiffs from the yard. There, where the Jew freezes the individual, folkish self-assertiveness awakens. It is in large part the same misery that also unites the proletarian under the revolutionary banners. His will, too, that things should be different, better, cannot be separated from the misery that preys on his mind. But there is something more there which the peasant's resistance, wherever it is organized, is still missing today, but which has left the worker a 50 years workers' movement in his blood, a sense of mission. When the Internationale begins to sound amidst the march of the metropolitan columns, then the hard-driven prolet feels within himself the burning desire that he may someday fare better, the dogged certainty that he himself is the bearer of a historical trend, a member of a history-shaping force. The peasant, however, is still today revolutionary only out of hardship, not out of sense of mission. The battle against the revolution, therefore, will be made within the metropolis. But certainly never again the peasants. A white ring of the country under fascist flags would be the starvation of the revolutionized city. The object therefore is to produce the peasants as the second wave of the revolution, and also, of course, to interest them economically. The peasant question in Germany. National communism cannot consider preaching a reformed national socialism, but nor can it consider preaching a reformed Marxism. The suggestion that nationalism offers on the subject of the peasant question are only in regards to the necessity of not destroying the eternal category of the soil-bound peasant. Never can they undermine socialist economic planning. But Dr. Rosikat is right when he states, the German peasant thinks not at all of voluntarily relinquishing his self-sufficient economy. His ideal is not like the proletarians, self-abolition as a social stratum. On the contrary, his is autonomy at any price. The advantages that communism promises him hold no selling power over his desire to work independently on his own soil. The communists like to refer to Russia. There the peasant followed Bolshevism, so why not also one day in Germany? To answer, I may be permitted to point to the following differences. 1. In Russia, the peasantry has been won by an enormous gift of land. In Germany, this gift can only turn out poorly. Compare the program of the Third International 4th 8 Section 4. 2. In Russia, the peasantry did not know, in contrast to today's Germany, that this gift was only of a provisional nature. 3. Russia, under communism, remains, in contrast to Germany, agriculturally self-sufficient. Its farming as such is not endangered. But is the peasantry not in any case doomed to be merged into large-scale enterprises because they are technically superior? Answer, not in Germany. The sheer superiority of large farms can really only be demonstrated in extensive grain producing and livestock farming areas, for example America, Australia, Russia. In the expansive, low mountain areas of Germany, they are not at all effective. In the intensively cultivated German lowlands, they are present in areas of arable crops, although not to such an extent that they would not be more than compensated for although not to such an extent that they would not be more than compensated for through the voluntary overtime that the peasant performs in the interest of his own self-sufficiency. The peasantry is capable of agreeing to a social order which fulfills the total elimination of capitalist class rule without necessarily having to sacrifice itself. It can help establish a socialism in which the means of production of all capitalists and large landowners, in addition to the entire transportation, finance, banking, and wholesale sectors, are socialized. Foreign trade is monopolized, and voluntary, state-subsidized cooperatives flourish in the non-capitalist economic sector. The German peasantry is furthermore well on its way to overcoming the liberal conception of property and to comprehending its right of possession to the soil as the mandate of the nation. It is entitled furthermore to exercise these rights of possession, turning them towards the fulfillment of large-scale tasks. Here an independent development occurs in the peasantry, a progression towards a communal economic mode of thought, which unfortunately, because it retains the form of the individual economy, is misunderstood by Marxism as reactionary and feudalist. An order which exhibits the above-mentioned characteristics may justifiably, and without a distortion unfortunately so common today, be described as socialist. It means not only the breaking of capitalist class rule, the eradication of the contradictions between oppressive and oppressed classes, but also the rule of the ideals of plan and community, because the working nation holds every commanding height of the economy firmly under its control. Thus is a small peasant farm, maintained within the framework of the planned economy, cooperatively bound, with second and third farmers' sons, farm laborers, and settlement-craving city dwellers on the expropriated estates of the big landowners, alongside state-owned farms but not collectives, required partly due to the soil properties of the land as in Russia, the demanded German form of farming enterprise in socialism. Council state or corporate state. The basic demand for the economy in National Revolutionary Socialism can only be all power in the hands of the nation. So too is there the parallel concrete demand for a state structure. The state is a sovereign nation. Its legislative and executive organs are the mandataries of the folk, which means in consequence the council state. The principle of self-governance expressed within it is in no way racially foreign, volksfremd or typically Russian, rather it is the old Germanic democracy. even the German national politician Martin Spahn says about it, the council idea strives to bring spirit and active living back to our folkish existence, völkisches Dasein, once more. It is consciously a construction from below. Those who live together and who work together, all who know one another and have common horizons, should lay the foundation of its administration, and only those involved in laying these foundations should afterwards help build the floors and finally may assist in placing the copestone. This is what Baron von Stein intended. Through this he promised the beneficial outcome of the folk's participation in the state. Elections to the council assemblies, which take place in an indirect form, staggered from the local council up to the Great German Council Congress, Großdeutschen Rätekongress, breaking up the parties, forming the administration agencies authorized to the executives. This alone provides a true reflection of the people's will, Volkswillens, irrespective of distinctions of economic interest. All working people are eligible to vote. The foundation is the working district, i.e. the enterprises, Betriebe, while for the free middle classes, who in Germany constitute a large social layer, it is the residential district. The plural voting system, which prevails in Russia to the detriment of the peasants, is therefore unfeasible. The council formations establish special committees, peasant chambers, worker chambers, on an occupational basis. All elected delegates in them, the council parliaments and the executive bodies are recallable at any time, are each at any time accountable to the forum responsible for their mandate, and have an income which is no higher than that of the previous profession. In primary elections, the village councils, city councils, and district councils are elected. The process is run by administration agencies. The next highest council assembly is not directly elected by the primary elector, but comprises delegates of the respective lower council parliaments in each Gau, which on the basis of tribal classification will replace the current dynastic states, dynastischen Länder. The highest formation is the Greater German Council Congress, which fulfills legislative functions and commissions the government. The Council Constitution, which through its Greater German Foundation involves every working German in the fate of the nation, is to be straightforward and logical, without any literary flourishes. As for the bureaucracy being wound up at all, it will be liquidated. The civil servant type perishes. The economic interests which hitherto have been fighting one another in the guise of ideological parties, the role of syndicates in the parties, will be eliminated from the state body, the organizational apparatus of the parties shattered. A goal, incidentally, employed by the young German order, in its own state building, obscured only by the somewhat romantic terms neighborhood cure chapter. An entirely new social body thus arises, that which finally, as a real volonté générale, represents the unity of the nation, sprouting from life and its bearers, the generational line of the people, not falsified through party and caste, but tied to the state. Councils in the sense demonstrated here have already been formed before, in Cromwell's armed formations. Lenin's model was above all the Paris Commune, and Gustav Landauer rightly pointed to the old German Ting as inspiration. Today, however, it has become fashionable among many national groups to proffer the corporate state as the successor to moribund parliamentarism. For that reason, an entire universalist worldview of distinctly Catholic characteristics, by the way, has been crafted by Ottmar Spann. And yet, just as little as his revolutionary biological epigonies understand the fact that the organic inherited state of the Middle Ages cannot be replaced today by the occupation, was he able to conjure away or cover up the anti-state thinking contained therein. The corporate state, in being established on the occupations and thus on the earning interests of its elected representatives, signifies only the perpetuation of interest groups upon the transformation of the state's outward form, a new opportunity for making the economy the fate of folkish life. It is conceivable that for some estates answers may be found, but it is also certain that no sovereign state policy can be advanced even if production is functioning, that above all, the shared public responsibility for the nation will be smothered in a tangled mass of corporate organizations. The state here is, in essence, only a manufacturing company. From here too, the problem of leadership acquires no new meaning. Socialism and the council structure, however, do not want to negate nor destroy leadership, merely to integrate it into the service of the whole. Who will lead is whoever works most for a community, whoever works best for them. The possible starting point in the competition for proof of worth and commitment must always be the same. The result will always be different. Corresponding to aptitude and achievement, there will be leaders and led in the future. There will be leaders and led in the future too. But this designation will provide to them the law of life and qualification, not an arbitrary separation by case. Even the question of Nordic leadership substance could only be decided like so, through performance for the struggle of the entire folk. If Nordic blood is indeed the creative, state-building, heroic element in the German folk, then the revolution undoubtedly clears the way for it to prove its leadership capabilities for itself. Socialism, we recapitulate. We are socialists. That means, at the moment of revolution, we demand 1. Nationalization of land and soil, distribution of the large estates. All land ownership in the future will be the mandate of the nation. 2. Transfer of all large-scale and medium-scale enterprises of industry, banking, department stores, mineral resources, mining and transportation into the hands of the folk. 3. State-planned economy with a monopoly of foreign trade. 4. Weapons in the hands of the whole. Establishment of a people's militia, Volksheer. Any doctrines of profit-sharing and private management which guarantee, even partially, the private ownership of the means of production and the commodity character of land are semi-fascist diversionary maneuver. A planned economy like that demanded by Werner Sombart in his Future of Capitalism, Zukunft des Kapitalismus, which envisages private property and social property, private economy and social economy, is one of the many half-measures desired today for all intents and purposes only as a last resort, including by the Tat people. This includes primarily Strasser's German socialism, but also, for example, the Possedism of the werewolf. The fundamental law of true nationalist socialism remains, the economy in the hands of the nation. This law applies as much to industrial enterprises as the question of property, but above all, however, does it serve as justification for autarky and the monopoly over foreign trade. Prussia as a principle. There is one thing socialism cannot ignore, the reality of Prussia. There indeed, as both Oswald Spengler and Müller-Vandenbroek identified within the Prussian style, is the type of state socialism which we have demanded arise within the German territories. It already exists in them in embryonic form. There has that choice for we over I, for unity and polarity, already manifested itself, in contrast to the Marxist conception of society, a creative self-existence grounded in blood and steel, and experienced as a demand, not as some special opportunity. Of course, one must keep in mind that there is another side to these things. It is no coincidence that the synthesis became Prussianism and socialism, e.g. Spengler's glorification of the human carnivore. Even the Prussian principle is today in danger of being misused. Only Prussia is historically capable, seeing itself always as the correlate of the eternal German. Only Prussia, which incorporates the old Junker tradition, meets demands of Baron von Stein to involve the folk in the responsibility of the state. Never, however, should the veneration of that old Prussianism, which is popular in some circles, such as we have reflected in the writings of R. Ludwig von der Marwitz, with their unbelievable invective towards the youth leagues, their contempt for the liberation of the peasants, for self-government reform, and for the Jacobins of 1813, be answered with anything other than a declaration of war. No such transitory forms of Prussian statehood, unconditional antagonisms from a period of upheaval, but instead the plea to be a servant of the state as lived and embodied by Frederick II, that is, the formative power that cannot be renounced and which instead forms the basis of state power, as indeed Russia has well taken note of. That Prussia, of which the knightly orders dream when they erected the massive battlements of Marienburg, and one must be clear about this too, is another source of will, and one that is unacceptable if one is not ready to accept the foundation of faith behind the vows which shape the people, nature, and histories of the Teutonic Knights and determine the direction of their will, Christianity. The unifying rationale for today's heathen idea of the state is not to be drawn from Hermann von Salza nor from Ludwig von der Marwitz. Only from the Potsdam of Frederick the Great can one make the leap over the philosophers of Hegel's total state and his Marxist inversion to reach the socialist statehood of tomorrow. For this nationalism is unchristian, unchristliche, then and now. The personal fate of the Prussian officer Trenck shows what it's all about. Personally plunged by the king into the most painful depths, this former favorite of the king and beloved of the king's sister, after 9 years of inhumane suffering in the casemates of Magdeburg, dedicated at the end of a ruined existence his life's confession to the spirit of Frederick the Unique. This clearly illustrates that in Prussia no oath is subject to recall. Only through this ethos, which uniquely and irrevocably is able to bind the Germans of tomorrow to the socialist nation, will Germany live, and therefore Prussia must be, Prussia as an attitude, Prussia as a principle, Prussia as a spiritual reality. As Müller von den Bruck put it, Germany cannot do without Prussia, because it cannot do without Prussianism. Prussianism, that is, the will to the state and the recognition that historical life is a political life in which we must act as a political people. It goes without saying, of course, that this is not about the country of Prussia, which will have to be subordinated to the organic, decentralized unity concept through the council structure of the tribal regions. The ancestral heartland of Prussia indeed did not establish a biologically distinct but historically existent new tribal concept, but Prussia's impulse of will. One could always say that it is about Germany's Prussianization. Socialism will transform German citizens into appendages of the German state. The contradictions between nation, folk and state will be abolished by it and refashioned into a new synthesis. It is obvious that the old medieval imperial idea, Reichsidee, of the supranational Christian ruler, which the German emperor still embodies a la Dante, has nothing to do with this. Its end goal, too, the pacification of the world by the scepter bearer of the imperium, has faded away into irrelevance. Socialist Germany is of a different essence entirely. And yet it represents the Germans all the same. The class struggle is a nationalist demand. The class struggle is not an invention of the Jew Marx. It is a fact of daily life, reflecting the labor contract between employers and employee, as well as the functions of press, state, and cultural life. It is a battle line established by those who are in possession of the economic means of power, imposed on those below, who respond with fury. It doesn't require a moral judgment, but instead a stated decision on which side we want to fight. The class struggle is not some artificial construct. As everywhere in the life of cells, new, young life replaces the old and feeble. So too in the body of the Volkskörper, is the old leadership class, after fulfilling its function for a community over a certain period, replaced by new forces, usually with violence. This is the class struggle, irrespective of the fact that this process is playing itself out amongst all peoples, a course of events in the life of the Volksleben, a process of reversal against the leadership forces within a Volksorganismus. Just as every previous revolution had its sociological bearer, the clearest example being the bourgeois French Revolution, so does the revolution in which we are situated. The working class, which is today pounding at the gates of German history, will have to battle against the class struggle with the current holders of the economic resources and instruments of power, so that it can have both transferred into the worker's hand at the moment of revolution, thus being ready to declare itself a nation and to replace the old leadership. The class struggle is quite clearly grounded in nationalism, and, to make use of a word too often misused by charlatans, absolutely organically, as Ernst Karl puts it. Quote, "The nation appears to us as a universal collection of divisions that are characterized through their discordant stratification, horizontal, vertical, religions, professions, ideologies, and so on. One of its most significant structural principles is that of horizontally tiered layers, whose higher points are distinguished by attributes not considered suited to the lowly: tax exemption for the clergy, university education for the bourgeoisie, privilege to political offices for the nobility, economic access for the capitalists. Each of these national strata develops its own special societal customs and mores. Yes, they even form their own separate realm of life. Proletarians marry only proletarians, nobles only nobles. But the entirety of these strata only latently belong to the nation. It is a historical law that, at any time, the nation is represented only by one specific group. Every action by this group, all of which serve only its own interests, are suddenly placed into a different light and maintain the most crucial significance for the entire nation. The ratio of stratification, as it presents itself at any given point in time, today, for example, was always based originally on the value and power relationship underlying the stratification structure. The group that is in power once incarnated the essence of the nation. It earned its position. Through the biological process, however, the ruling stratum always loses its vitality and its authority to represent the nation more quickly than it does its privileges, while at the same time drawing up new strata from below to fulfill by itself the destiny of the nation. The ruling stratum has to return to dormancy. It has to become the wood and trunk of the nation, in other words, to go down in history while new cells are formed that assume the function of the life-giving rings. This analogy seems a good one. It demonstrates that the formation of the wood is as essential as the steady growth of the bark. It also demonstrates the revolutionary act of infusion with fresh sap in spring, of bursting buds, followed by a period of peaceful growth. The lower stratum should on principle demonstrate its strength by infusing itself alone, something which it is dependent on in most instances. Its fight against the old stratum, which refuses to give up the armchairs of power, is class struggle in the true sense of the term. It embraces all areas of folkish life, cultural and economic. Our present ascendant class, in whose hands lies the destiny of the nation, not only has the ever-present obstacles to overcome, acquiring education, entry into good society, but it is also hindered by a certain objective state of affairs opposed over its young life, capitalism. This sets against every best intention an insurmountable obstacle. This class must therefore be given at least a chance to prove itself, regardless of whether it proves useful or not. This should go unsaid. This can only be achieved through the elimination of capitalism. Only a new economic system can provide the guarantee for a folkish life. That is to say, that the struggle of the proletariat for those things that are all-encompassing, culture and economy, is in its modus a purely economic one, which is not to say that the prospective economy then from itself gives birth to a new culture. No, it only sets free the forces for its potential development. But since capitalism, against which the fight for the proletarian class is directed first and foremost, is superbly held by the sinking bourgeois class, and, conversely, holds fast to the bourgeois class in turn, so is every struggle against the bourgeoisie, against their morality, art, religion, ethics, a struggle against capitalism, and, at the same time, a struggle for the proletariat. Which is again not to say that capitalism necessarily conditioned or created this morality, art, religion, or ethics. For this version of the concept of class and class struggle, it is not feasible to see any other outcome than that the proletariat, subsequent to its own time and economic system, is superseded by something new in the struggle. If it is possible to completely eliminate class divisions and bring about new strata which no longer have a class character, then it will be within these new social bodies that the class struggle continues, which is nothing but the struggle of ascending and descending life, a cycle that will never stop, except when the world finally stops. The justification by which every semi-fascist rejects the class struggle is a simple conjuring trick. The class struggle is the reality of capitalism, the Volksgemeinschaft the reality of socialism. To operate under this statement is nothing more than an intellectual dishonesty. For it is precisely because socialism is supposed to become a reality that the Volksgemeinschaft can only be preached as a goal, never as a slogan for whitewashing the prevailing capitalist world as it exists today. To conclude, we are socialists, hence against the class struggle is simply illogical, because one cannot abruptly assign a criterion of tomorrow to today, cannot employ a goal to negate what is existent. Even the opposing slogan of the 97% used by the Tet Circle and the Black Front is a fiction. Even provided that Thrid's wealth and income statistics are correct, these 97% do not possess a shared consciousness. The fight is led by those who want it. Of the statistically disinherited, as the politics of the day hourly prove, a large part of the 97% willingly defends the 3%. The slogan of the 97% is fantasy, the class struggle is fact. There are also the comments made by the Archive for Politics and History as early as March 1925. The fundamental reality of today's European social order is that the rift, the polarization from which socialist doctrine emanates, no longer passes through the nation's bourgeois society, but instead runs through the world society, through the nations of Europe. Indeed, it splits the whole world down to the middle. The proletarian primal experience of bondage and slavery is in today's Germany the national social experience, or at least it should be. Today there is no longer simply a politically free, economically and socially unfree, exploited proletarian class, and alongside it an eternally oppositional class of exploitative, privileged property owners, or rather, this antinomy is relative to the world historical polarization process of which we have been witnesses and victims, i.e., it has become secondary according to the ranked order of historical values. Instead, there are now proletarianized and non-proletarianized nations, and this in the midst of Europe, which in the course of its long history never before knew this kind of antagonism, and at any rate would not stand for it in the long run. The momentous world historical document which has established or legalized this new status for Europe is the Versailles Peace Treaty. It is therefore essential to finally raise this new condition into the clarity of consciousness, so it can be made the basis of experience which determines our whole outlook upon the world. Versailles. The enemy of revolutionary nationalism remains Versailles. There is little we have to say thereof, but always remember that is the boulder that weighs down upon Germany's freedom. The path to nationhood, the path to socialism, the path to revolution leads only through the tearing up of all treaties and pacts from Versailles to Yann. Anyone who betrays this realization by sniveling for revision betrays the German future, betrays the socialist nation of tomorrow. The path to the sovereign German nation leads only through the restoration of Greater Germany, i.e. solely and exclusively through the ruins of the system of Versailles. The Frenchman Jaurès shows up the right response. The Frenchman Jaurès shows us the right response. The fatherland is not an idea that has outlived its usefulness. The concept of the fatherland evolves and deepens itself. I have always been convinced that the proletariat in its innermost being cannot accept any doctrine of national renunciation, of national servitude. To revolt against the despotism of kings, against the tyranny of the ruling class, yet let the yoke of conquest and the rule of a foreign militarism be imposed without any resistance, is such a childishly pathetic contradiction that at the first alarm of invasion, all forces of instinct and reason would have to be swept away for it to make sense. That the proletarians who are not liberated from capital by the conqueror should consent furthermore to be a tributary is a monstrosity. The reality, however, is this. Wherever there is a fatherland that is a historical group that is conscious of its unity and continuity, then any attack on the freedom and independence of this fatherland is an assassination attempt against civilization, a relapse into barbarism. Revolutionary foreign policy. The revolutionary nationalist conception of foreign policy is therefore clear. A front against Versailles, which means a front against the West and its eastern and southeastern satellites, which involves taking up the old slogan of Brockdorff-Rantzau, against capitalism and imperialism. A slogan for which the words of Moltke cannot hold true. It is a hard lot to be a patriot in Germany, for one is forgotten. Yet he is nonetheless the wayfarer of our insurrectionary will. It means forming a fighting community with the adversary of the Versailles world, Russia, only in league with Russia, which as the first socialist world power will be a natural ally for a socialist Germany, can the German Eastern question be resolved, which at the same time will determine the existence of Poland. The same front includes all the oppressed peoples of the earth, alle unterdrückten Völker der Erde. In place of a colonial policy, the League of Oppressed Nations will be brought under German leadership. These are the political front lines, all while the NSDAP is in racial sympathy with England, full of resentment and romanticism. Its anti-Russia policy a capitalistic mercenary attitude, its exclusive Italian agenda suggestive of dogmatic obsession. So exists the fronts in the world today, created by the class struggle of nations. The foreign policy of a folk is invariably conditioned in part through the struggle, What the others do or do not do is never doctrine, but instead always a question of expediency. Therefore, this policy cannot be made by a Germany of Hindenburg or Hitler, but can only arise from a revolutionary Germany. The New Faith. Brüning, rightly described as the greatest German chancellor since Bismarck, governed not only by virtue of the bureaucratic and organizational leverage of the state he represented, not only because finance capital bestowed all its support upon him as a solid advocate against social revolution. This Roman chancellor of the German nation was the master of Germany because he is one of the few men of our day who live from faith, who act from faith, who is supported by a spiritual reality, faith in eternal Rome, and faith can always and can only be overcome by a new faith, never through negation, never through skepticism. Eternal Rome will only disappear from the German regions when faith in eternal Germany replaces it. Rome, and with it all Western Christianity, can with utmost tranquility face the trite pseudo-enlightenment of the free-thinking circles, the tasteless invective directed against the priesthood. By virtue of its faith it will be able to master such mere anti-tendencies. Yet, with all the disquiet and unrest today, Rome is already confronted with the beginnings of a new faith, the approach of a German Renaissance. And from here it is understandable if, for example, the work of Rudolf Panwitz or Stefan George is branded dangerous by the Christian intellectual circles which Ludwig Klages bitterly fought against. If on the edges of today's politics, the still unfinished attempts of the circles around Ludendorff to work on a new German faith were answered with hate and scornful vilification. Here, where the outline of a new paganism shines forth, a new cosmic religiosity centered in blood, soil and race, rooted in the divine breath of worldly life, here do the first axe blows fall upon the edifice of the Oriental faith, which overshadows the people. And if German nationalism has a deep spiritual and religious sense, then it is that, as Rosenberg recognized, but then recanted under the pressure of his Catholic master, of an insurrection of the Germanic way of life, poisoned and suppressed since the days of Charlemagne the Saxon slayer against the foreign infiltration of Christianity. The new paganism, the renaissance of the German faith, will be the living justification and the power source of the German Revolution. Only if one succeeds in calling the gods back home will the mission of unity of form, faith and blood be set into motion. There is still little to declare today in regards to its actual content, but one thing must be made clear in a period where Wilhelm Stapel's Christianization of politics is ever more insistently praised as the theology of the new nationalism, where Hans Blücher's sharp pen is regrettably and ever more noticeably put into the service of Christian regeneration. Politics has established its own laws within German faith once more. Ethics have none of their own in that area, but nor do they have any business having any. It is worth repeating, the German transformation which we are in the midst of today is influential in all areas. It shapes our century politically, economically, culturally. It transforms the individual in his spiritual structure and in his attitude towards his surroundings. This German Revolution is thus in itself a great totality, encompassing the whole of life and asserting itself in life's every aspect. In its justification, it is not only on the religious level a struggle against passionless, corrupted, distorted church, but also an uncompromising struggle against the essential substance of Christianity, which at its core is alien and disastrous to the German nature. We have to grasp Ludendorff's merciless observation: Christianity is the poison by which peoples perish, die Völker sterben, as we begin to recognize the political tendency of the main line as the most dangerous adversary. Often, however, a fatal misconception becomes active within the resolution of religious problems. unsatisfactorily blending them together with the political task. The rebirth of the religious life of our time and the fulfillment of the German political mission are two things that demand a clean and honest separation. And he who is called primarily to the one has no business applying the valuations of that task to the field of the other. Who understands both may draw strength from that, but may not distort the borderlines between them. Here a clean division is required. And also here a clean division is required, and also self-restraint and awe. From today's strife, we seek to mold the German Reich of tomorrow in all fields of human activity. That is our task. Its guarantee is socialism. Its promised gestalt is the political unity of a free nation. Its path is the struggle for power revolution. On this path, the slogan of the coming parish of those who are in awe of the eternal has no place. God's kingdom and the realm of the gods both demand service and readiness. His kingdom is not of this world. However, it is not greater than the holy kingdom of the earth, merely another. Your faith in God must not break your service to the gods. As you enter through God into the kingdom which is not of this world, you need the gods still, so that the kingdom of this earth does not perish. And you know now what it means to be a guest of two kingdoms, a wanderer between both worlds, to have a share in the graces of each, graces which both act as connections to the forces of life. It is precisely this that must be recognized by those who partake of grace in order to know both worlds, and only they will ultimately be able to bear responsibility for their decision. It is their personal tragedy to witness the impossibility of crossing between them. Woe to them if they, who are guests of both kingdoms, wanderers between the two worlds, frivolously seek to infringe the borderlines between them. If they want to replace the political, suprapersonal values of communal freedom and will to power with Christian ranting about the Sermon of the Mount, if they adulterate the slogan "Everything for Germany" with the addendum "Germany for Christ." The religious transformation of our folk and of the entire Western world goes side by side with its political restructuring, the priestly people responsible for the first, the heroic for the second. Both are a task set before the men of our type. Each man must feel the call, that which calls to him above all else. And those who have a sense of both should not lose sight of autonomy of both these processes. Otherwise, they will end by... And those who have a sense of both should not lose sight of the autonomy of both these processes. Otherwise, they will end by betraying each one. As Max Weber says, and this is a practical conclusion which demonstrates this realization for everyday life, all ethically oriented action can be classed under two different maxims. It can be an ethic of ultimate ends or an ethic of responsibility. That is, it can be dictated by the kingdom of God or by the kingdom of this world. The absolute ethic of the religious man does not question the harmful consequences of action. It has to do with one's own purity. For the politician, however, the principle holds true: thou shalt resist evil by force, or else you are responsible for the evil winning out. Also, the early Christians knew full well that the world was ruled by demons, and that he who engages in politics, that is, with power and violence as a means, enters into a pact with diabolical powers, and that for his actions it is not true that only good can come from good and only evil from evil, but often the opposite. Anyone who does not see this is indeed a political infant. Nationalism demands political action. The watchword is Germany, only Germany. For this goal, we are prepared to give up everything. Yes, everything, even our own clean slate, even religiously our own salvation, prepared to become guilty for the sake of the goal. And only those who are ready for this self-sacrifice, only they may be involved in politics, because only they are allowed to make demands. The priest, however, responsible for building the future faith, must himself remain pure. Both are divinely ordained destiny. He who as a person lives religiously must be aware of this divide and try to resolve it within his own life. But once again, do not blur the boundaries when acting. Everyone must serve these two masters because he is human, and when he leaves one, he receives a thorn in the flesh. Quote by Faber's Leonardo. Only then will he be able to shape German politics, and that is the situation today. One will come when the hour is ripe and will be mercy. The other, however, is duty. But we will never accept Christianity's claim to absolute right, which it must by its very nature elevate and extol, as the Catholic Hochland demonstrates, for example. So then, as against the national idea as the only possible attitude, the first priority is preservation of the Christian religion and the intimate communion of all Christians. Only afterwards comes the preservation of the individual nationalities, meaning that even relatively valuable things, being of lesser worth, have to give way if they will endanger the unparalleled value of Christianity. It must always be kept in mind, however, that while it may not be the task of Christianity to preserve nationality, the influence of Christianity will always be to support the valuable assets of the nation. What is true of the national also applies to cultures. They are not an autonomous factor separate from and independent of Christianity, but a subordinate and dependent whole subsumed within the Christian idea overall. Here there can be no bridge, here only war applies. The order of the nation. Whoever fights today for nationhood through the socialist revolution cannot, the grounds for this have been set out here, aim for the destruction of the Marxist mass party, nor for a settlement with Marxism from the outside. He can probably well believe that folkish reality permeates the revolutionary act, as opposed to false or half doctrines, which Russia shows to be a concrete possibility. He will have to leave that judgment, however, up to life and its laws. Revolutionary Marxism is already marching for revolution and socialism today. The new order which emerges from the swell of this upheaval will be, in our opinion, not the universal humanity anticipated by its theorists, but the community of sovereign socialist states. Not the path, but the signpost is wrong. The forces over on the other side, engaged under red swastika flags in a 10-year struggle for freedom and bread with all the fervor of their hearts, who with glowing faith likewise stand in the military camp of the German Revolution, they must be unfastened from their fascist and semi-fascist straitjackets. Involving them alongside the marching red battalions in the decisive battle for a socialist Germany remains the task of nationalist communism. Will have to prove itself to them. That will never, however, include those masses who follow the drummer from Braunau. They expect only the salvation of petit bourgeois existence. The few will be instead the indispensable. The socialists, the activists, the proletarianist folk, whom the class struggle of the nation never returns to the private sphere. They will be the fighters sought for the Hitler front. It's all about them, to fashion them as an order of the nation, inextricably sworn to the watchword of eternal Germany, belonging only to it, involuntary allegiance to the red flag with hammer, scythe and sword. Committed to the political front of workers, peasants and soldiers, as the crack troops of the national revolt in Germany. That is what needs to be tackled. the duty of revolutionary nationalism to be proven in infinitely detailed work. A mass base in parallel with the NSDAP is for such a task naturally impossible. One of the preconditions, however, which national communism is able to resolve, the unification of the national revolutionary groups it represents. And we hereby demand from the German public that the groups, leaders and circles in today's Germany who ideologically and practically occupy the fighting positions sketched out here in this broad outline finally put aside all personal and organizational reservations and, instead of working out the nuances of these described here, take steps towards practical cooperation. We call for Werner Lass and the Confederates, Jupp Hoven and the Young Prussian League, Ernst Niekisch and the Widerstand Circle, Rolf König and the Jungen Kämpfer, G. Schild and the German Socialist Combat Movement. We call for the Kommenden and the Circle around Friedrich Hilscher and his Reich. We call for the Graue Korps and the Gegner. We call for the Graue Korps and the Gegner to take in hands with us and with all the groups and individuals who fundamentally share this position, the preparations for a I'm just going to repeat it again. We call for the Kommenden and the Circle around Friedrich Schiller and his Reich. We call for the Graue Korps and the Gegner to take in hand with us and with all the groups and individuals who fundamentally share this position, the preparations for a unified national communist movement. Aloof from the sympathy or antipathy of leaders, aloof from organizational egoism of all kinds, aloof from theoretical hair-splitting, the nature of the response to this demand, submitted on behalf of an unlimited number of sympathizers, will be able to prove the hardness of our will and the authenticity of our decision. Can wait. We have become skeptical of the many revolutionary strategists who immediately predicted the German Revolution. True, the objective preconditions for it are indeed present in this period of increasingly clear economic crisis. But it lacks all the more subjective preconditions. Hunger alone is not sufficient. Today there is no dynamic force in Germany acting as an engine of revolution. That must, as bitter as it is, be recognized. Some will be discouraged. Some will therefore go astray. They do not matter. In Germany today, it is up to the few thousand young people who can wait, who, because they are aglow with the myth of Germany, can prepare themselves for the day that the steadily emerging order of the nation is clearly visible, hoisting the banner of eternal Germany that was rolled up by their fathers, and forming the columns of a German nationalist communism in the camp of the revolution. They call to us, these pages apply to them, they belong to us. We are certain that they will find their way to us.